Hey guys, so today I have this G20 330i in my garage, and I'm going to show you how to change the springs and shocks front and rear on this vehicle. Now, since this is rear-wheel drive and I haven't done an X-Drive G20 before, I'm not sure if there's any differences. However, the procedure for this is so similar to the F30. So I don't really expect to run into really any hiccups at all, and we may find that they've made some things easier. Before we put the car up in the air, let's take a look at the distance from the center of the hub to the fender. And I guess this model came with those roundels that automatically face upright. So I guess that's a nice little gimmick. So on this guy, we have a hair under 15.5 inches. And in the rear, we have a hair over 15.25 inch. So the first thing we'll need to do is pull the handle to release the hood, and we'll have to pull that twice. So let's take care of some things under the hood before we put the car up in the air. It's a little bit easier to access some of the stuff while the car is still on the ground. To access the shock towers, we're first going to have to remove the covers over the brake area, and this is a little bit easier on the G20. If we zoom in here, they just have these little twist tabs, so we turn to unlock, and then we can just pull the cover off. Next, we'll need to use a pry or trim tool to remove all of the expanding rivets holding this cover over the top of the top mount. So just like the F30, the damper piston strut is secured with an 18mm nut and a 6mm counterhold. So I'm going to go ahead and see if I can just break loose this nut first without counterholding it. Now, the depth to the nut from the top of the shock tower is deeper than the F30, so I am going to have to use this longer pass-through socket, and then I'll have to use this hex wrench here to just loosen things a little bit. I don't want to remove this bolt completely. I don't want to lengthen the assembly of the strut spring, but I just want to get that brake torque done so that when this is out of the car, it's not ridiculously difficult to get these apart. Now that that's loose, we can also go ahead and just loosen these 4 T12 bolts a little bit. So the G20's side jack point boxes use the same size pucks as the F30s, but the big issue with the G20 jack points is the side ones are so far apart, 73 inches from end to end or 70 inches from center to center, that a home lift like a quick jack, even the EXT model, won't reach the jack points. Luckily though, the width between the jack points from side to side is only about 60 to 61 inches. So if you have a quick jack EXT and you must have the EXT length, standard length will not work for this. You can place your quick jack skids orthogonal to the length of the car to lift the car that way. And now we're ready to send the car up. So let's go ahead and use our 17mm to remove the wheel. So one issue that people have, since these use wheel bolts instead of wheel studs, is the wheel wants to just fall right off as soon as you remove that last bolt. So what I usually like to do is I like to just support the bottom of the wheel with my foot right here so it doesn't do that. So once that bolt does come out, then I can just grab the wheel and move it like normal. So I have the front wheel knuckle assembly jacked up to its ride height. So from the center of the hub to the fender is roughly 15.5 inches. And I want you to take a look at how much clearance there is on the G20 between its damper top and the bump stop. Now you can see it's really nothing at all, and from the very tip of the bump stop you only have about a ½ inch of damper travel, and to the divot areas where there's a little bit more, you gain about an extra ½ inch, so about three-quarters of an inch. And this is kind of what you expect from BMW. They've been doing this a long time, using the bump stops as a secondary spring to provide support for the car once it rolls over. So one of the lessons from this is, if you're going to use lowering springs, understand that you'll probably be riding on your bump stops all the time with the G20, unless you go to shorter bump stops. So here we're looking at the rear bump stop of the G20, and I've actually got the suspension lowered an additional 3/4 of an inch from normal ride height, so that I could better get a measurement here, because the bump stop sits up inside the rear top mount cup like that. So at normal ride height, which we measured earlier, about 15.25 inch from center of hub to the fender, this will have 1.25 inch of damper stroke before bump stop engagement. So the first thing we're going to remove in our wheel well is this end link mount, and this is going to be a 16mm nut with a T30 counterhold. Usually you can go ahead and get the brake torque on it without using the counterhold, so I'm going to go ahead and try that right now. And then to get it completely off, you'll need a pass-through socket. I use an extension on mine. And as a quick trick, I attach the T30 counterhold to my impact and I spin that instead. So for the impact, we're going to set it to spin Tighten or right hand. And that will drive the end link out of the nut. Now we can pull the end link out and set that forward in the wheel well and out of the way. If you have the adaptive suspension or EDC suspension on your car, there will probably be some more mounts with wires for an accelerometer and a solenoid valve to control the adjustable damping that you'll also need to unclip. Next, I'll get a jack to support the rotor and knuckle assembly. And then we'll go ahead and undo the knuckle clamp bolt, which is an 18mm bolt on the front and a 16mm nut on the rear. Now we can go ahead and pull out this bracket that contains brake and sensor wiring. Next, we're going to have to use this special tool to spread the knuckle, and you can see that it's slimmer on one side, fatter on the other, so we're going to insert it so that the slim side fits into between the knuckle, and then we can rotate it 90 degrees so that the fatter side spreads the knuckle apart. Once that's spread the knuckle, we can go ahead and release it from our ratchet. I also find that it helps putting a little bit of penetrating oil in between the strut and knuckle interface. Now we can begin to lower the jack and the knuckle assembly. If you need a little bit more wiggle room, you can go ahead and go to your top mount and start loosening those E12 bolts some more. As we lower the knuckle assembly, just watch out for your headlight leveling sensor here. This is on the front left side. Now we can take our knuckle assembly and just kind of push down on it and really gotta try and rock it out. So this assembly wants to spring back up. So you really gotta kind of fight it and push it down to get to this point here where the bottom of the strut can pop out. So I've loosened the top E12 bolts so that this strut can rock back and forth in order to get to this angle, and that's an absolute requirement. So once I get it to here, then I can go ahead and unbolt the strut from the top and remove this assembly out. And if you need a little bit more clearance with the wheel speed sensor line, you can go ahead and unclip it here from the bracket. Now I'll finish removing the E12 bolts from the top, and I will pull the strut assembly out of the bottom. Now that the strut assembly is out of the car, I'm going to go ahead and take my spring compressor and compress the spring. Now that the spring is compressed, we can go ahead and take our 18mm pass-through and 6mm counterhold to get the top mount nut all the way off. And this is much easier to do now since we did that initial brake torque while the car was still on the ground. Now we can take the top mount off along with the dust boot and bump stop, and then we can remove the damper from the spring. If we take a look at the bump stops, you can see that the G20 is way longer than the one that came with my F31. In fact, I believe this is the same bump stop that's used on the X1 right now. So if you have a base suspension G21 and you lower your car and need lower bump stops, well, it looks like you can just go grab F31s. So now we'll go ahead and put our springs back onto the strut assembly. If you have a tag on it, make sure you read it and see if it says unten or lower, because this side will be the side that goes on the bottom of the strut. Now that we've got the spring compressed and put it over the strut, we can go ahead and drop in our dust boot. Make sure that you find the end stop of the dust boot, because that's supposed to go against the end of the spring here. So I'll go ahead and align those, drop that in, get the stop against the end of the spring, and then we can take our bump stop and drop that in. Then lastly, we can take our top mount and place that in as well. And this didn't go in super easy for me. Like, I actually had to press it into the dust boot, so just be aware you may have to do that. And then once you've got the top mount on, go ahead and take that 18mm nut, push the top mount down, and get that started. Now that the top mount's on, we'll go ahead and take our 6mm hex and our 18mm pass-through wrench and tighten that top mount nut as far as we can go. Now we can come back to our front knuckle assembly, make sure that the wires are out of the way, and we can put our strut assembly back in. Also, the dampers or the struts have a little nub in the back that's supposed to go into the slot in the knuckle, so make sure that's aligned as you're jacking this up. Now I will use the jack to jack the knuckle onto the strut assembly until it's fully seated and until I start to see the spring compress. Once the spring starts to compress, then I know the damper is fully seated in the knuckle. Now that the knuckle is fully seated onto the strut, I can go ahead and remove my knuckle spreader tool out of the back. And then I can take the knuckle clamp bolt right here and place that through. And then of course I'll want to place this bracket over here, over it. And this rear section of the bracket back here, this slots into the opening in the knuckle in the back. And then we'll take the 16mm nut and place it on the back of that bolt and then get these guys tightened down. And then this will get torqued to 44 Newton meters or 32.5 foot-pounds. Now before you let down your jack, make sure that everything is fully seated and aligned so that you have these two alignment pins on either side that go into holes on the shock tower. And then go ahead and take some of those E12 bolts and get those threaded into the top mount so that when you lower your jack in the front, the assembly doesn't fall out. Now let's make sure to get any of the wires that you may have unclipped before resecured into their brackets. Now we have to put the end link back in its mount. And then we'll put the 16mm nut on there. Then we can take our T30 counterhold and pass through socket again and drive the nut on. And if you're using an impact like I am, you'll set the impact to a left-hand turn. And then this nut will get torqued to 56 Newton meters or 41.5 foot-pounds. One thing you'll notice about my torque wrench is I have the crow's foot at a 90-degree angle from the wrench head, and it needs to be set at a 90-degree angle. Otherwise, the torque that's set on the wrench won't be the torque that's actually applied to the extension here that I'm using. So to remove the damper, we will have to undo these three E12 bolts up here at the rear damper top mount, and they're tucked away behind the liner a little bit better than they were in the F30, so an extension might help. Additionally, if you have EDC or adaptive M suspension dampers, don't forget to unplug the acceleration sensor. Actually, the rear doesn't have acceleration sensor, it just has a solenoid valve control, so you'll have to unplug that. And then also we have this line here that's on the damper bracket that will have to pop out. Next, we'll have to go under the car and remove the four 10mm nuts from this underbody shield. Okay, let's take a look at a couple of the bolts on the lower camber arm here. All the way on the left, we have the bolt that holds the camber arm to the wheel carrier assembly. This is an E20 socket on the rear, and on the front it's a 21mm nut. So this bolt inserts from the rear. Over here we have the lower bolt that holds the damper or shock absorber in, and that is an 18mm bolt which enters from the front and an 18mm nut on the rear. So these two bolts enter opposite of each other. All the way on the far right we have the camber bolt, and sometimes when you remove this bolt, it is so difficult to try and get this wheel carrier assembly, the bushing here, to align with the bolt and get it through both sides. So what you may have to do sometimes is you may have to loosen your camber bolt over here. Now before you do that, you can see there's some markings here. Do what they did. Grab a whiteout pen or a paint mark or something, mark some witness marks so you know where you were at. So that way when you do get this aligned and in and tightened and you have to go and reset that, you can set it to the same alignment position and you won't have to get a new alignment. So to finish removing the damper, I'm going to go ahead and use my 18mm and now we can take the shock absorber and press down on the top mount to compress it. and then pull it out. Well, I guess I'll move this cap first. So here is the rear damper, and it has this cap on top which you'll have to pull right off. This just pops right off. You'll notice that it has this little pin over here which slots into a hole there. And underneath that black cap we have a 16mm nut and a 5mm hex counterhold, so the same as the F30. So once again, in order to get that apart, you're going to need a pass-through socket, right? Place that over there, and then grab your 5mm hex counterhold to hold the shaft. Please don't use an impact on this. One thing you can do to try and help you get this apart is use a very high quality hex key like this and brace it against the concrete, so you can try and get your brake torque that way while counterholding. And there you go. So now that the nut is off, we can take the top mount off as well as the bump stop assembly to swap the damper. So to put our damper back together, we'll take our bump stop, and I've already just kind of smashed it in here a little bit so it's a little bit easier to pop in on video, but we'll do that and we'll just pop it in till the cup sits into the groove. Then we can take our damper, drop this on top, grab the top mount, also drop that on top, and then take that 16mm nut and begin threading it back on. And then once again, to like fully tighten it down, we will use a 16mm pass-through and a 5mm hex to counterhold. And then final torque on this is going to be 38 Newton meters or 28 foot-pounds. Now we'll go ahead and undo the E20 and 19mm bolt and nut for the wheel carry assembly so we can drop the camber arm and pull the spring out. Note that I have my jack supporting it over here. So now you can see I've got my jack supporting the arm, and I've actually lifted it up a little bit so that this bolt can just slide right out. Next we'll lower the jack, and the lower arm will slide out of the knuckle. Now we can go ahead and grab the lower arm and pull down on it like that so the spring assembly can be pulled out. One thing to note when putting your new spring in is make sure that the spring pad at the bottom is in the correct orientation. So down there we can kind of see a spring pad, and it has a nub in it that goes into a hole on the camber arm, so just like the F30. Now we'll go ahead and put the damper back in, and you'll probably have to push down on the top to compress its length to get it in there. And then also don't forget that this bracket points towards the rear of the car. So I did something silly and I forgot to put the top cap on the rear damper top mount before I installed it. Luckily with these stock dampers, they have such a low gas force that you can compress them pretty easily by hand, which is not something you can really do with some of the aftermarket dampers out there like a Bilstein monotube. So because I can do that, I can go ahead and just get this in here with the damper kind of already installed in the car. I need to make sure that this rear pin aligns with its hole over here, but aside from that, there, we are good to go again. Alright, we're back under the car now, and I am just raising that camber arm to try and get the ball joint in it. Sometimes you may have to take the knuckle itself, rotor unit, and just push down and see if you can get it to align with that. So I'm going to need to go up a little bit more. Up, and you can see there I've gone too far. If you're having difficulty aligning the hole with the ball joint, you can do what I do is I grab a screwdriver and I can get it in there, and then I articulate it into the position I want. Once that's aligned, we can go ahead and kind of start getting our bolt threaded in there. If you can't get it in all the way, that's okay. You can get it started and then screw or thread it in. This one's actually not being too bad for me right now. I was able to get it in almost both sides. Next we'll want to take our E12 screws, and we just want to get them started so that the damper stays aligned. Like, the damper actually isn't sitting flush against the body right now, but as we jack up this rear assembly, we want these holes to be aligned so that we can tighten them later. Now that the damper's in, go ahead and insert that 18mm bolt from the front, and then we'll put the 18mm nut back on the rear. Now that the rear damper top mount bolts are aligned, I'll go ahead and jack up the rear wheel till it's in what's called the normal position, or that's where the wheel is in its normal ride height when the car is on the ground. So to get that measurement, once again, I'll go from the center of the hub to the fender, and I believe our measurement was right about 15¼ inches. Now that the rear suspension is in the normal position, we can start torquing down the bolts. The reason why we don't want to torque these bolts with the car suspension at full droop is because then we're not setting the bushings to their correct area. Does it make a huge difference? Probably not, but this is what BMW recommends. So we'll start with the lower damper bolt, which once again is an 18mm bolt on the front and an 18mm nut on the back, and this torque is 100 Nm or 74 foot-pounds. Then we'll do our wheel carrier bolt, which is a E20 bolt, which enters from the rear, and a 21mm nut on the front, and this torque is 165 Nm or 122 foot-pounds. Lastly, if you undid your camber bolt over there, that has the same 165 Nm or 122 foot-pounds as the wheel carrier bolt. And that one is bolt enters from the front and the nut is in the rear. Don't forget to tighten down the E12 bolts for the top mount, and these will get torqued to 28 Nm or 21 foot-pounds. Now that everything is tightened down, we can go ahead and release our jack and lower the suspension back down. And then we'll take our bottom cover and put it on its 4 posts on the bottom side of the camber arm, and then secure it with the 10mm nuts. The torque spec on those nuts is only 6 Nm, so it's basically just hand tight. Now we can go ahead and put our rear wheels back on and get those fastened with the 17mm socket and the 14mm bolts. Now we can lower the car back onto the ground so that we can finish tightening up things in the hood. Now that the car is on the ground again, we can go ahead and take our E12 and tighten down all 4 of these top mount bolts, and then these will get torqued to 28 Nm or 21 foot-pounds. Then we're going to have to take our 18mm pass-through socket and our 6mm hex counterhold so that we can get final torque on the shock top nut, and this is going to be 64 Nm or 47 foot-pounds. Then we can go ahead and place the top mount cover back on. So it's got a little plug that snaps into the portion directly over that strut top nut. And then go ahead and take the expanding rivets and place them back into their locations. And then the last thing we have to do is put our cover back in. You'll notice that there's 2 tabs in here that go into 2 slots in the back. So make sure those are aligned. Then go ahead and drop it down and turn the key to the locked position. And then we'll finish by taking our 17mm and torque wrench and torquing our wheel bolts to 140 Nm or 104 foot-pounds.